Step away from him right now. Officer, he's not breathing. I'm trying to revive him. I'm not here for arguments. I said move. I'm doing nothing wrong. I need to keep him alive.
What started as a terrible highway crash quickly turned into something nobody at the scene could believe. A man was fighting to save a stranger's life on the side of the road. Cars were stopped. Witnesses were screaming for help. Every second mattered. But instead of helping, one officer made a decision that changed everything. The worst part? The entire thing was caught on camera. Not just body cam footage. Traffic cameras captured it too. Witnesses pulled out their phones. People standing nearby recorded every command, every shout, and every second that followed. And once that footage became public, the department could no longer hide what happened that night. By the end of this story, one officer would lose his badge, a city would face a massive lawsuit, and millions of people would be asking the same question. How do you mistake a man giving CPR for a criminal? Before we continue, I want to know where you're watching from today. Drop your city and state down in the comments. I always love seeing how many people from all over the country are following these stories together. And if you believe helping a person in danger should never lead to handcuffs, make sure you subscribe right now. Because the story you're about to hear is one of the most shocking cases we've covered yet. Stay with me, because the details only get more unbelievable from here. Omari Ellison was 41 years old and lived a quiet life built around helping other people. Friends described him as the kind of man who never looked away when someone needed help. If a neighbor's car broke down, Omari was there. If a storm knocked out power in the area, he checked on older people living alone before he even checked on himself. For more than 15 years, he worked overnight shifts in respiratory care. The job was hard, stressful, and exhausting. But people who worked with him said he stayed calm even during the worst moments. He spent his nights helping patients breathe, comforting scared families, and dealing with emergencies that most people could never handle. Omari also kept a fully stocked first aid kit in the trunk of his car at all times. Bandages, gloves, breathing masks, flashlights, everything neatly packed and ready. Some people laughed about it and called him the prepared one, but Omari always gave the same answer. You never know when somebody might need help. Even after long shifts, he still stopped for stranded drivers on the side of the road. He still helped people change flat tires. He still stayed behind when others kept driving. That Friday night, Omari had just finished a 12-hour shift at work. He was tired, hungry, and ready to get home. The roads were wet from rain, and traffic was moving slowly under the highway lights. He had no idea that within the next few minutes, his entire life was about to change in front of dozens of cameras. The rain had finally slowed, but the highway still glistened under the streetlights. The smell of wet pavement mixed with gasoline drifted through the air as cars moved carefully across the slick road. Omari drove with one hand resting on the steering wheel and the other near the heater controls. His body felt heavy after 12 straight hours at work. He was already thinking about home. Maybe he would heat up leftovers instead of cooking. Maybe he would just take a shower and go straight to bed. It felt like a normal Friday night. Then everything changed in a split second. A pair of headlights suddenly swerved across the highway ahead of him. Tires screamed against the wet pavement. Omari watched as a pickup truck clipped the side of a dark SUV near the center divider. The SUV spun hard. Once, twice, then it rolled onto its side with a violent crash that echoed across the highway. Pieces of metal and broken glass scattered across the road. Several cars slammed on their brakes. Horns blared in every direction. For half a second, traffic froze. But Omari was already moving. He pulled onto the shoulder, threw his car into park, and reached into the trunk for his emergency bag. Rainwater splashed against his shoes as he sprinted toward the wrecked SUV. Other drivers stayed back near their cars, shocked by what they had just seen. But Omari ran straight toward the danger. He wasn't thinking about himself. He wasn't thinking about police or cameras or what could go wrong. He was thinking about one thing only: keeping whoever was inside that SUV alive long enough for help to arrive. Within seconds of the crash, people all across the highway started calling 911. Some callers reported the rollover accident. Others described smoke coming from the SUV and asked for ambulances to hurry. Panic filled the background of nearly every call as drivers stood outside their cars, watching the scene unfold in the rain. But one caller focused on something else entirely, or rather, someone else. As Omari reached into the damaged SUV and tried to pull the injured driver into a safer position, the caller became fixated on him instead of the crash victim. The dispatcher asked what was happening at the scene. The caller answered nervously, "There's a large black man pulling somebody around inside the vehicle." The dispatcher quickly asked if the man appeared violent or dangerous. There was a pause. The caller hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "I don't know. He just looks aggressive." At that exact moment, Omari was doing chest compressions on the unconscious driver. Rain poured down his face as he counted under his breath and tried to force air back into the victim's lungs. His medical gloves were covered in water and blood. Broken glass crunched beneath his knees every time he shifted position. But from a distance, one frightened caller didn't see a man trying to save a life. They saw a black man moving quickly in the dark and decided something must be wrong. That single phone call changed the entire direction of the night, because the words "aggressive male" were the details that reached responding officers first. Not Good Samaritan, not medical help, not man performing CPR. And by the time police arrived, those missing details would matter more than anyone realized. Officer Coulter Vance had worked for the department for almost 10 years. On paper, his record looked solid enough to stay on patrol. But inside the department, his name had already appeared in more than a few complaints. Several drivers had accused him of turning simple traffic stops into aggressive confrontations. Some claimed he raised his voice quickly, reached for handcuffs too fast, or treated black drivers like suspects before asking basic questions. One complaint said he ordered a man out of his car for looking nervous. Another claimed he pointed a flashlight into a family's vehicle for nearly 10 minutes during a stop over a broken taillight. But none of those complaints led to major punishment. Most were closed quietly after short internal reviews. And over time, Officer Vance stayed on the street. That Friday night had already been rough before the highway crash call came in. He had responded to several tense situations during his shift, including a loud domestic dispute and a fight outside a gas station. According to later reports, he was irritated about being forced to stay late for overtime. Then dispatch sent another call through his radio. Possible disturbance at vehicle accident scene. The dispatcher also repeated the words from the 911 caller about an aggressive male near the victim. That was the information Officer Vance heard while driving toward the highway. Not that someone was giving CPR. Not that a man was trying to save a life. Just possible disturbance. As rain hit the windshield of his patrol car, Vance pressed harder on the gas pedal and sped toward the flashing lights ahead. And before he even stepped out of the vehicle, he had already decided what kind of scene he expected to find. Officer Vance pulled onto the shoulder so fast that water sprayed from beneath his tires. Before the patrol car had fully stopped, he pushed open the door and rushed toward the overturned SUV. Red and blue lights flashed across the wet highway. Drivers stood near the guardrail watching in silence while Omari knelt beside the injured man, still pressing both hands firmly against the victim's chest. Vance moved straight toward him. "What are you doing to him?" he barked. Omari did not stop the chest compressions. "He doesn't have a pulse," he answered calmly between breaths. "I'm performing CPR." The victim's head rested against broken glass while rainwater ran down the side of the crushed SUV. Omari kept counting quietly under his breath as he worked. But Vance stepped even closer. "Move away from him right now." For the first time, Omari looked up. His face showed pure disbelief. "Sir, every second counts," he said carefully. "This man needs help." Instead of checking the victim, Officer Vance reached down and grabbed Omari hard by the wrist. "Put your hands behind your back." Several people nearby immediately started shouting at once. "He's helping him. He's doing CPR." But Vance ignored the crowd completely. Omari slowly raised his hands away from the victim and tried to stay calm. "Am I being detained for helping somebody?" he asked. The question hung in the air for a moment. Vance never answered it. He only tightened his grip around Omari's wrist and pulled him backward away from the unconscious man lying on the pavement. And as the officer focused on controlling Omari, the victim was suddenly left without anyone performing CPR at all. At this point, People standing on the highway could hardly believe what they were watching. An unconscious crash victim was lying on the wet pavement. A man trained in emergency care was trying to keep that victim alive. And instead of helping, the first officer on the scene had stopped the CPR and grabbed the person giving aid. Even witnesses nearby sounded confused. Some shouted for the officer to listen. Others pointed at the victim and begged police to let Omari continue helping. But Officer Vance stayed focused on Omari. Not the injured man, not the overturned SUV, not the emergency happening right in front of him. And what makes this moment even more shocking is that the body cam footage later showed Omari staying calm the entire time. He never yelled. He never threatened anyone. He never fought back. He only kept trying to explain that someone needed medical help. So far, do you think the officer handled this situation correctly? Type yes or no in the comments. What Officer Vance did not realize in that moment was that nearly everything happening on the side of the highway was being recorded. A state traffic camera mounted high above the interstate had a clear view of the entire crash scene. The camera captured the flashing patrol lights, the overturned SUV, and the exact moment Omari was pulled away from the victim. Vance's own body cam recorded the encounter from only a few feet away. Every command, every movement, every second of confusion after he arrived at the scene. The microphone clearly picked up Omari saying, "He doesn't have a pulse." It also captured him calmly asking, "Am I being detained for helping somebody?" At the same time, a food delivery driver parked nearby had already started recording with his phone before police even arrived. His video showed Omari kneeling beside the victim while other drivers stood back in shock. Two witnesses near the wreck could also be heard shouting over the rain and traffic noise. "He's doing CPR! He's trying to save that man!" One woman repeatedly yelled. "Why are you stopping him?" Those voices would later become important during the investigation because they proved something critical. People at the scene understood what Omari was doing almost immediately. But Officer Vance either failed to understand it or ignored it completely. And then there was the timing. The cameras showed the exact moment CPR stopped after Omari was pulled away from the victim. Second by second, the footage documented how long the injured driver went without help, while the officer focused on handcuffing the person who had been trying to save him. Every word, every command, every lost second, captured from multiple angles with nowhere for anyone to hide once the footage became public. Officer Vance pulled Omari backward, away from the victim, with both hands locked tightly around his wrist and arm. Water splashed across the pavement as Omari lost his balance for a moment near the side of the wrecked SUV. But even then, he did not fight back. He did not yell. He did not pull away. Omari immediately complied and slowly placed his hands behind his back. "I'm not resisting," he said clearly as the body cam continued recording. "That man needs medical attention." Behind them, the unconscious crash victim still lay motionless beside the overturned SUV. The crowd, watching from the shoulder of the highway, began shouting louder now. People could not understand what they were seeing. "He was helping. You arrested the wrong person." A man near the guardrail pointed toward the victim and yelled, "Check on the driver." Then one woman screamed the question that would later spread all over social media after the footage was released. "Why are you stopping CPR?" But Officer Vance ignored every voice around him. Instead of turning toward the injured driver, he focused completely on securing the handcuffs around Omari's wrists. The metal cuffs snapped shut beside flashing ambulance lights and the sound of rain hitting the highway. At that moment, several paramedics were still trying to reach the crash scene through stopped traffic. No one else had stepped in to continue the chest compressions after Omari was pulled away. And the cameras captured something chilling. For nearly a full minute, nobody touched the victim at all. No CPR, no medical care, nothing. The man who had been trying to save a life now stood handcuffed beside a patrol car, while the injured driver lay alone on the wet pavement only a few feet away. By this point, the scene on the highway had turned completely upside down. The injured driver still needed urgent help. Witnesses were begging officers to focus on the victim. And the man who had stopped to save a stranger's life was standing in handcuffs beside a patrol car. What shocked many people later was not just the arrest itself, it was the timing. According to the camera footage, precious seconds were lost while Officer Vance focused on detaining Omari instead of checking the condition of the crash victim. Even after multiple witnesses explained that Omari had been performing CPR, the officer continued treating him like a suspect instead of a good Samaritan. That moment quickly became one of the biggest parts of the public debate once the footage was released online. Some people argued the officer was simply trying to control a chaotic scene before understanding what was happening. Others believed there was no excuse for interrupting life-saving medical aid without first checking the facts. And that raises an important question. Should officers be held legally responsible if they interfere with life-saving medical care during an emergency? Comment your thoughts below. Hours after the arrest, the truth finally started coming out inside the police department. At the precinct, supervisors began reviewing Omari's identification, work history, and professional records. What they found changed the entire case almost immediately. Omari Ellison was not a threat. He was not a violent suspect. And he was not some random bystander interfering at a crash scene. Omari was a licensed respiratory specialist with advanced emergency response training and more than 16 years of experience working in trauma care. For years, he had spent his nights helping patients survive medical emergencies. He had been trained to respond calmly during life-or-death situations exactly like the one on that highway. The realization spread quickly through the department. According to later reports, several supervisors were stunned after learning who had actually been placed in handcuffs. Because while officers treated Omari like a danger at the scene, he had actually been the most medically qualified person there. Not the officer, not the crowd, not even some of the first responders were still trying to reach the highway through traffic. The man in handcuffs was the person most capable of keeping the victim alive. And once that fact became known, the questions inside the department started changing fast. Why was CPR interrupted? Why wasn't the scene properly assessed first? And why had an officer ignored multiple witnesses who clearly said Omari was trying to save someone's life? Those questions would soon become impossible for the department to avoid. Before sunrise the next morning, the case had already reached the highest level of the department. The police chief was notified about what happened on the highway. At first, it was described as a routine arrest during a crash scene, but as more details came in, that description quickly changed. By morning, Officer Vance was placed on administrative leave. It was not a slow or quiet decision. It happened fast, almost like the department understood that what had taken place needed immediate review. Internal Affairs moved in right away. They collected every piece of evidence connected to the incident. That included body cam footage from Officer Vance, radio dispatch recordings, and the traffic camera video from the interstate above the crash scene. They also gathered witness phone recordings that had already started spreading online. Within just a few days, the department announced a full misconduct investigation. No small review, no internal summary. A full case examination from top to bottom. For many people watching from outside the department, the speed of these actions said a lot. Police departments do not usually move this fast unless something serious is shown in the footage. And as more people began to see clips from the highway, public pressure grew even stronger. The question was no longer just what happened at the crash scene. It became why it happened, and how a situation involving life-saving CPR turned into a handcuffing instead. As investigators went deeper into Officer Vance's history, a much bigger picture began to form. They found what years of complaints had already hinted at, but never fully proved. Records showed that Vance had repeatedly detained black motorists during suspicious person calls where no actual crime was happening. In many of those cases, the situations were later confirmed to be misunderstandings or false reports. One stop involved a man fixing his own broken-down car. Another involved a father waiting outside a store for his child. Both were treated as potential suspects at first contact. The files also showed 6 prior complaints for unnecessary escalation during routine encounters. Even more concerning, 3 of those cases involved people trying to help during emergencies. In each case, witnesses said the individuals were acting as good Samaritans, not suspects. But none of those complaints led to serious discipline. Most were closed quietly after internal review. Some were marked as unfounded or insufficient evidence. Over time, a pattern had formed inside the department, but it stayed buried in paperwork and closed files. This time, however, things were different. There were no missing details, no unclear reports, no way to explain away what the cameras had captured on the highway. For the first time, investigators could see the full situation from start to finish, in real time, from multiple angles. And with that clarity, what used to be hidden in old complaints could no longer be ignored. A pattern that had existed for years was finally out in the open. As more details from the investigation came out, the conversation around this case started to grow far beyond one highway incident. People were no longer only focused on what happened between Officer Vance and Omari on that rainy night. They were also asking bigger questions about training, decision-making, and how officers respond under pressure when they arrive at emergency scenes. In this case, one wrong judgment call changed everything in seconds. A man performing CPR was treated like a suspect. A life-saving moment was interrupted, and a victim was left without help at a critical time. Now many people are asking if this kind of situation could be prevented in the future. Should officers receive stronger training on how to identify medical emergencies faster? Should there be more focus on how to de-escalate situations before making arrests in unclear moments? And should bias awareness training be required more often, especially in high-pressure situations like crash scenes? These are the questions now being discussed after everything was revealed. Because what happened on that highway was not just about one arrest. It became about how quickly misunderstandings can turn into life or death consequences when decisions are made too fast. So now we want to hear from you. Do you believe every police department should require mandatory anti-bias and de-escalation retraining? Drop your answer below. 36 days after the highway incident, the department reached its final decision. Officer Vance was officially terminated from the police force. The termination was not based on one single mistake alone. The department listed several serious violations in its final report. These included unlawful detention, interference with emergency medical aid, and failure to follow basic conduct standards during a critical incident. In simple terms, the report said his actions directly disrupted a life-saving situation and escalated it without proper reason. At first, the police union stepped in to defend him. They argued that he was responding to a chaotic crash scene and making quick decisions under pressure. For a short time, it looked like the case might become a debate between procedure and interpretation. But then the full footage was released. Once the body cam, traffic camera, and witness videos were shared publicly, the reaction changed quickly. What had once been described as a confusing situation was now seen clearly from multiple angles. Within days, public support for Vance dropped sharply. Even some who initially defended him began to question how the situation had been handled. The visuals made it difficult to argue against what the cameras showed. A man performing CPR being pulled away from a victim who needed urgent care. As pressure grew, state officials stepped in next. They began the process of reviewing his law enforcement certification. That process moved toward permanent revocation, meaning he would no longer be allowed to serve as a police officer anywhere in the state. For Vance, the outcome was final. His career in law enforcement, which had lasted nearly a decade, ended not with retirement or transfer, but with termination and loss of certification. What began as a highway call ended with the complete collapse of his career in uniform. After the criminal and internal investigations moved forward, Omari also took the case to civil court. He filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against both the city and the officer involved in the incident. The complaint listed several serious claims. It included racial profiling, unlawful arrest, emotional distress, and interference with emergency medical care during an active crisis. The lawsuit explained what happened in detail from Omari's point of view. It described how he stopped at a crash scene, performed CPR on an injured driver, and was then removed from the situation while trying to explain that the victim needed urgent help. For months, the case moved through the legal system. Lawyers reviewed footage, witness statements, and official reports from the crash scene. Every piece of evidence pointed back to the same key moment on the highway. Then, 10 months after the incident, the city made its decision. A settlement was reached. The amount was $4.2 million. The case did not go to trial. Instead, both sides agreed to resolve it outside of court. But even after the settlement, Omari made something very clear in his public statement. He said the case was never about money. For him, it was about something much bigger. It was about making sure people never become afraid to help somebody in danger, he explained. His words shifted the focus away from the dollar amount and back to the moment on the highway, when a decision had been made in seconds that affected multiple lives. The settlement closed the legal chapter of the case, but the public discussion around it continued long after the papers were signed. After the settlement was reached, many people expected Omari to simply step away from the situation and move on with his life. But what he did next shifted the focus of the story once again. Omari first used part of the settlement money for his legal expenses and for trauma counseling. The experience had been intense, and he made it clear that he needed time to process everything that had happened on that highway. But he did not stop there. A large portion of the settlement was directed toward programs that reflected what he cared about most. He donated to CPR education programs that teach everyday people how to respond during emergencies. His goal was simple: make sure more bystanders feel confident stepping in when someone's life is on the line. He also supported emergency response scholarships for students who want to study medical care and trauma response. These scholarships were designed to help train the next generation of people who may one day find themselves in situations like the one he experienced. In addition to that, Omari contributed to organizations focused on police accountability and training reform. These groups work to improve how officers are trained to handle fast-moving emergencies and how they recognize when civilians are providing life-saving care. For Omari, these decisions were not about attention or recognition. They were about prevention. He explained his thinking in a simple but powerful way. If fear stops ordinary people from stepping in during emergencies, he said, then everybody loses. His message focused on the idea that emergencies do not wait for perfect systems or perfect decisions. They depend on people acting quickly, calmly, and with confidence. By investing in education and training, Omari hoped to reduce the chances of situations like his ever happening again. The same highway where everything went wrong became the reason he wanted to help others learn how to do things right. And for many people following the story, this part of his journey stood out just as much as the incident itself. Because instead of walking away from what happened, he turned it into a way to prepare others for moments where every second truly matters. As part of the final settlement agreement, the department was required to make major changes to how officers respond to situations like the one on the highway. These changes were not suggestions, they were not optional. They were court-ordered reforms that had to be put in place and followed. The first major change was mandatory emergency scene assessment training for all officers. This training focused on helping officers quickly identify what is happening at a scene before taking action. It included recognizing medical emergencies, understanding bystander assistance, and slowing down decision-making in unclear situations. Another key reform introduced new rules that prevent officers from interrupting active life-saving efforts without clear medical justification. This means that if a civilian is providing CPR or emergency care, officers must first confirm the situation before stepping in to stop it. The department also created an independent review process for all suspicious person detentions. This was meant to ensure that future stops are examined by outside reviewers, especially when there are complaints of bias or misunderstanding. In addition, body cam retention policies were expanded. This meant that footage from incidents like the highway crash would be saved for longer periods and reviewed more thoroughly, making it harder for important evidence to be missed or deleted. Finally, civilian oversight was increased for excessive force investigations. This gave members of the public a greater role in reviewing serious complaints involving police conduct. Each of these reforms was designed to address different parts of what went wrong during the incident, from how officers interpret calls, to how they respond on arrival, to how decisions are reviewed afterward. Taken together, the changes represented a major shift in how the department would operate going forward. For many observers, the reforms were seen as a direct result of the footage, the investigation, and the public pressure that followed. They showed that the incident did not just end with discipline or a settlement. It also led to changes in policy meant to prevent similar situations in the future. But even with these reforms in place, the story of what happened on that highway continued to be discussed far beyond the department itself. A year later, Omari found himself on the side of the road again. It was another crash, Another set of twisted cars. Another night where strangers stood back in shock, unsure of what to do next. He had been driving home when he saw the scene, and pulled over without hesitation. The moment felt familiar, in a way that was hard to explain. The flashing lights were the same. The sound of fast-moving traffic was the same. The smell of wet pavement and broken glass was the same. For a brief second, it could have felt like that night on the highway had come back all over again. But this time, the response was different. Officers arrived quickly, but they did not rush in with confusion or force. They looked at the situation first. They spoke to each other. Then they turned toward Omari and the other bystanders. "How can we help?" one of them asked. It was a simple question, but it changed the tone of everything at the scene. Omari stepped forward and began to assist the injured person again. This time, there was no interruption, no misunderstanding, no sudden escalation. Just teamwork, just focus on the victim. As the minutes passed, Omari noticed something else that felt different. People around him were no longer stepping back or staring at him like he was doing something wrong. They were not confused by his actions. They were not afraid of his presence. Instead, they trusted him. They followed instructions. They gave space when needed. They helped where they could. And for the first time in a long time, Omari was simply seen as what he had always been, a man trying to help. At the same time, departments across the state had already begun changing how officers are trained. New lessons focused on recognizing medical situations faster, on listening to witnesses more carefully, on making sure that help is not mistaken for danger. The goal was simple: to prevent confusion from turning into harm, and to make sure that the next time someone stops on the side of the road to save a life, they are supported instead of stopped. Omari Ellison never expected any of this to happen in his life. He was just driving home after a long day at work. He saw someone in danger on the side of the road, and like he had done many times before, he stopped to help. He did not run away. He did not freeze. He did not wait for someone else to act. He stayed calm in a moment filled with chaos. He used his training. He tried to save a life. And even when things turned against him, he kept his voice steady and his actions clear. He also refused to let fear or pressure silence him. He asked the right questions. He explained what he was doing, and he stood by the truth of what was happening in front of him, even when no one seemed to be listening at the time. Because of that one night on the highway, the impact went far beyond a single arrest. One officer lost his badge. A department changed how it trains its officers, and millions of people saw a real example of how quickly things can go wrong when a situation is misunderstood in a matter of seconds. But they also saw something else. They saw how powerful evidence can be when every angle is recorded, and how important it is for truth to come out clearly, even when the first impression is wrong. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to see it. Subscribe for more stories about justice, accountability, and ordinary people who find themselves in extraordinary situations. And before you go, there is one final question to think about. If you had been standing on that highway and witnessed that arrest yourself, would you have spoken up?